And then you can turn that off. Thank you. All right.
I think we'll give it another minute and then we'll begin.
All right. What? Okay, good. Pull that door too. I need it shut. No, it's not. Are you going to say a word about the Institute?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Bill, I'm looking forward to the day that we can get together and do this in a live space with Maria and crowd.
I do my podcast from here, and while I enjoy them for the sake of information, it doesn't create the intimacy of a studio.
Right.
Okay, I think we're ready to begin here. So I just want to see, yes, okay. Hello and welcome to the first event in our series on racism, discrimination, and othering, perspectives from around the world. I'm Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Alanson White Institute of Psychoanalysis, Psychiatry, and Psychology. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I would like to thank members of the Institute's administration who have made our series possible. Dr. Elizabeth Krimendahl, our director, Mr. Richard Herman, Director of Administration, John Aumann, and Elizabeth Rodman. I'm also very grateful for the work of the members of my committee. They are Anton Hart, Tom Hennis, Gurmeet Kanwal, Catherine Nordzi, Lad Novak, Jean Petrucelli, Hopeton Shaw, David Solomon, Masato Tsujikawa, and Cleone White. Thank you. We are also thrilled with our registration today of over 450 people from around the globe, including India, Japan, Romania, Belarus, Ukraine, South Africa, Canada, and of course, many states in the US. So to all of you, welcome. I've already had a question about could the audience be seen and heard? You cannot be seen or heard, but you can, if you have not already, send in a question in the Q&A box, which is on the lower portion of your screen. I want to thank everyone who's already submitted questions for our speakers, and we will try to get to as many as possible. And again, during the meeting, if you have some thoughts or questions, please feel free to add them in the Q&A box below. In terms of the format for our meeting, our program will begin with a conversation between our guest, Bill Moyers, and Carol Jenkins. Carol Jenkins' interview of Mr. Moyers will be followed by questions for either guest from the audience. Racism, discrimination, and othering. All over the world and throughout human history, while select groups of people have enjoyed countless economic, social, and political privileges, others have been excluded, discriminated against, and oppressed. In some countries, the relations between powerful and the powerless are enforced and justified through racist ideologies. In others, through the discourses and practices of segregation and disenfranchisement based on social class, caste, culture, religion, gender, or language. Our year-long online series will illuminate racism, xenophobia, classism, and other forms of discrimination through their international, cross-cultural, and interdisciplinary study. We will explore the ideologies and practices implicated in widespread social, economic, and political inequities in various parts of the world. We hope to learn how these processes operate in different cultures, as well as how they are confronted, protested, and overcome. This morning, we begin our series in the United States. Our guests today are Mr. Bill Moyers and Ms. Carol Jenkins. A broadcast journalist for more than 4 decades, Bill Moyers has been recognized as one of the unique voices of our times, one that resonates with multiple generations. With his wife and creative partner, Judith Davidson Moyers, Mr. Moyers has produced such groundbreaking public affairs series as Now with Bill Moyers Journal, and Moyers and Company. Since the company founding in 1986, other notable productions have included the landmark 1988 series, Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth, as well as Healing in the Mind, The Language of Life, Genesis on Our Own Terms, Moyers on Dying, Moyers on Addiction, Close to Home, America's First River, Becoming American, The Chinese Experience, Faith and Reason, and Moyers on America. For his work, Moyers has received more than 30 Emmys, 2 prestigious Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Awards, 9 Peabodys, and 3 George Polk Awards. In the first year it was bestowed, Moyers received the prestigious Honorary Doctor of Fine Arts by American Film Institute. A Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he also received the Career Achievement Award from the International Documentary Association and has been honored by the Television Critics Association for outstanding career achievement. Moyers was elected to the Television Hall of Fame in 1995. The Museum of Broadcast Communications calls Moyers one of the few broadcast journalists who might be said to approach the stature of Edward R. Murrow. Moyers' books include such bestsellers as Listening to America, The Power of Myth, Healing in the Mind, The Language of Life, Moyers on America, A Journalist and His Times, and Moyers on Democracy. His most recent book, Bill Moyers Journal, The Conservation Continues, was published in May 2011. He currently serves as the president of the Schumann Media Center, a nonprofit organization that supports independent journalism. So thank you for being with us here this morning, Bill.
It's a pleasure, Maria. Good to see you and Carol.
Carol Jenkins, our moderator, is co-president and CEO of the ERA Coalition and the Fund for Women's Equality, sister organizations dedicated to the passage and enactment of the Equal Rights Amendment. She is an analyst and commentator on women's issues and an Emmy Award-winning writer and journalist. Carol is also the co-author with her daughter, Elizabeth Hines, of Black Titan, A.G. Gaston and the Making of an African-American Millionaire, a biography of her uncle and winner of the Best Nonfiction Book Award from the American Library Association's Black Caucus. Ms. Jenkins is based in New York City and is available for media interviews and speaking engagements. And I should also add that she is the aunt of one of our very dear analysts, Cleone White. So welcome, Carol.
Thanks so much, Maria. I'm a part of the family.
Exactly.
Thank you so much to the Institute and to all of those who've joined us today. And Bill, I want you to know, Maria mentioned the Joseph Campbell interviews. I want you to know that once you did that, I was always a fan, but you really just set the bar so high for what a conversation could do. And I'm still following my bliss because of you. And thank you for all of your contributions.
The same
today,
the same to you. I've watched you over the years and seen your work, read some of your work. It's an honor to be next to you, even though we're so far away.
I know. We promised to get together after all of this is over. But as we have this conversation, 25,000 armed troops are guarding the U.S. Capitol. Every state house in the 50 states of the United States has some sort of military presence to defend the operations there. I just need to know from you right away, because you've been thinking about this, talking about this, you're writing your podcasts and all, examining how we got here. The question I have for you is, was there any way that you saw during the last 4 or 5 years as this was all building. Did you have any idea of how we could have stopped it, where we could have taken a side trip and prevented ourselves from coming to this point in America where democracy is under such strenuous threat?
Yes, we could have elected different presidents because so many, half of the most recent presidents have not been friends of equal rights or civil rights, rights for women or rights for African Americans. And we could have handled the 2008 economic collapse differently so that it didn't affect people of color and poor people and working people so much that they became even further disenchanted from our political system. You know, Trump did not come from nowhere. The half of this country was ready for someone who could take the two political parties by their tie and shake them, because they had abandoned the vast majority of everyday people in this country to opt for the privilege and patronage of very rich people and corporations. Democracy contained, the reason I said change and elect different presidents is that, as we've seen, democracy is fragile. It contains the seeds of its own destruction. You can elect an FDR and you can elect a Donald Trump. You can elect a Barack Obama and you can elect a Donald Trump. So our political system went wacko, quite frankly. It deserted those for whom it owed its first allegiance. And I'm talking about both parties. The Republican Party led the way since Newt Gingrich came to Congress and invented or created or endowed the politics of combat. Ronald Reagan continued it, opening his campaign for the presidency in the little town near the place where 3 civil rights workers were killed during the 1964 civil rights movement. We could have made different choices politically and economically. And there were a number of points under that big umbrella of who do we elect, because politics really matters. But that's the big, broad trend that I saw coming and reported on.
Right. I know you did. And I appreciate your placing the going wrong point way before Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. So this ignoring of the population, there are some who say, in fact, that Donald Trump represents the psyche of we know that so many millions voted to re-elect him after what we went through, this move towards authoritarianism, so that we ignored who exactly. Go into more detail about, I know that part of our discussion should certainly be about women, because what we see here is not just the rise of racism, white supremacy, but the patriarchy and the devaluing of women in our society, which is why we're trying to amend the Constitution to put women in it for the very first time. Who do you feel are the most aggrieved and brought us to this point?
I couldn't pick out a single group. In regard to people of color, there was nothing new about this. Every time African Americans made some progress in this country, there was a backlash. After the Civil War, there was a backlash to Reconstruction. After the civil rights movement of the 1960s, there was a backlash, Reagan and the rise of the right wing. After every gain that Black people have made, there has been a pushback. That was true for a long time. It was 100 years between Lincoln's signing of the Declaration and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which Lyndon Johnson signed in 1964. When the first meeting of women in upstate New York were held, 1848, I believe it was, only one of the women present lived long enough to be elected. So you've had this this in a sense, we have a DNA which excluded from the beginning. Women couldn't vote. African Americans couldn't be citizens. Native Americans were moved to reservations. This resistance on the part of white males in particular goes back a long time. And you could choose, if we wanted to talk about every time an explosion occurred as their frustrations reached the surface, we also have to look at what happened after that. And it was usually not promising. You're working very hard now on the Equal Rights Amendment. Back in the 70s, my wife spent a lot of time on the road campaigning for equal rights. And look where we are. You know, there's still this deep-seated bias on the part of white males who embody the notion of white supremacy against any advancement. And that goes all the way back to before the Civil War. It goes before the founding of the Constitution. Can I read you something? This is one of the most important. This is Toni Morrison's book, The Source of Self-Regard. I'm sure you've read it. In here, she has the diary of William Byrd of Virginia, who was described by his fellow Virginians as Virginia's most polished and ornamental gentleman, a kindly master who inveighed in some of his letters against brutes who mistreat their slaves. But here, Toni Morrison found these excerpts from his diary, and he lived from 1710 to 1712. He was living in Virginia, a colony, not the United States. 2809, Jenny and Eugene were whipped. 41709, Annika was whipped. 51309, Mrs. Byrd was whipped. 32309, Molly was whipped. 61009, Eugene, a child, was whipped for running away and had the bit put on him, the horse's bit in the mouth. 9309, I beat Jenny. 91609, Jenny was whipped. 91909, I beat Anima. 113009, Eugene and Jenny were whipped. 121609, Eugene was whipped for doing nothing yesterday. In April, I was occupied in my official capacity in assisting the investigation of slaves arraigned for high treason. 2 were hanged. 7110, the Negro woman ran away again with the bit in her mouth. 7810, the Negro woman was found and tied, but ran away in the night. 71510, my wife, against my will, caused little Jenny to be burned with a hot iron. 82210, I had a severe quarrel with little Jenny and beat her too much, for which I was sorry. 83110, Eugene and Jenny were beaten. 10:8:10, I whipped 3 slave women. 11:6:10, the Negro woman ran away again. Why could he do that? Why did he do that? Virginia's most polished and ornamental gentleman, a kindly master. Why did he do it? Because he could. And because he could.
And what a treat we all have if Bill Moyers is reading Toni Morrison to us, even if it's horrifying detail. You know, that's a heck of a diary to have. You and I were talking a little bit earlier in the week about the Constitution, because, you know, certainly what I believe is that the reason that that this exists, you know, this disparity in our lives, is because the Constitution was faulty when written, because it was written to benefit white slaveholding men. You know, even women were not included in that, certainly not slaves or anyone else even thought about. And one of the pieces that has reared itself up to bring us to this point of chaos is the Electoral College, which was in fact created to benefit slaveholders, where their slaves could be counted at some fraction of a human life, in our society. And of course, that's where the riot took place, when we were certifying the attempt to certify the Electoral College votes in the Capitol. Do you think it should be abolished? And how do we begin that process? So it's one person, one vote. That's how we elect our presidents and everyone else.
I would hope it will be abolished. I don't think it will, because of its very, as you just said, it's very design prevents the kind of change that the majority would like to see. I do think there will be a way to make sure that we can make sure that the popular vote, that the electors are legally bound to the popular vote, so that you don't leave it to the individual state legislature to substitute electors of their choice and partisan background to the ones who should ordinarily go to the popular vote. I don't think we'll abolish it, because the Electoral College is designed to protect the small states who would be needed to abolish it. That's not likely to happen anytime soon, but it can be reformed.
So let's hope for reforming it. Then, one of the visuals that sticks with me, and as I've been reading, I know that you've talked about it too, that it was just perhaps one of the more horrifying things, other than the pure violence that we saw, was the sauntering of the Confederate flag through the United States Capitol, which was a thing that I thought I would never witness. That was so compelling in its horror. I was surprised. It's just a flag, but it stands for so much. And your reaction to seeing that?
Well, the historian of the hour, the historian of the month, and the historian of the year is a professor at Boston College, Heather Cox Richardson.
I read your interview with her. Well, stunning.
She's the author of this book, which is the one book I urge all of you watching to read this year, this week, this afternoon: How the South Won the Civil War. Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. She's been, I think she's the leading scholar now on the history of the Republican Party. And she studied the Civil War and on through, and how the party of Lincoln became the party of Trump. Brilliant analysis and very instructive. And when I asked her on the morning after, I called her the night of the insurrection. She lives in Maine right now. And I said to her, "Will you come on, let's do a podcast tomorrow?" My first question to her the next morning, I think we taped around 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. I said to her, "What were you thinking yesterday?" And she said, "I was watching and weeping, because I had never believed in my life that the Confederate flag would fly over the Capitol of the United States." And I said to her, "Not even Robert E. Lee made it that far." And she said, "It's such a symbol of the continuing aspiration of many millions of people," I'm paraphrasing, "to sever the Union again, attempt to reject the collegiality of nationhood, and to go their own way. It's a sign of betrayal." And she said, I wept. Well, I almost did. Judith and I watched what was going on here, and we couldn't believe our eyes. We saw the protests. We understand the protests, but when they went into the Capitol, they became seditionists and insurrectionists, rebels, just like the flag. I saw a man carrying the Confederate flag on what looked like a baseball bat. And I thought the symbolism of that, the symbolism and the reality of the weapon in his hand, the potential weapon in his hand, did take us back. Carol, this is not new. This is the latest Yellowstone explosion of that deep anger and resentment that lie below the surface of our country, and has since as I just read, before the Constitution. It was then sealed into the Constitution by the founding fathers, who believed in equality, but only for white males.
Right.
Women couldn't vote, as I said earlier. And they wanted, once they got that power, they could use that power to enhance their power and build their wealth. So the prejudice, the treatment of Negroes as inferior so that they could be scorned and needed to be contained, with the ambition of increasing their own wealth. Not all the founders, but they created a system that enabled white males to be the beneficiary of the control panel and of the consequences. And that then, you know, that I've got a quote here from
you know, I have a quote of yours, you know, as you're talking about this. You say democracy was supposed to be a check on the unbridled power of money. I was recently talking with some people in Boston, and I don't know whether you know about the wealth gap in a city like Boston, you know, northeast city, where for white Bostonians, the wealth is pegged at $250,000, and for Black Bostonians, it's $8. So that discrepancy. I want to talk a little bit about your. You were there when President Johnson, wanted to create this great society, and did so much, you know, in terms of just anti-discrimination, putting laws into effect. From that point, the Bill Moyers who participated in that, and the Bill Moyers of today who watched the taking of the Capitol, what is the difference in that your person, you know, in your youth, just starting in being a huge part of the conversation in this country, and today? How have you changed?
Well, first, let me say that Lyndon Johnson was a powerful central force in passing that legislation, but he would have been hapless if it hadn't been for the movement. This was one of those moments when real change comes because there's a surge from below, from what we call the grassroots, but in this case from young Black men and women in the South who stood against these the sheriffs and the police and the other racists. And there was a president who had not been known for his support of civil rights when he was many years in the Senate, although he championed a few inches at a time. He was ready. He was sensitive. He knew the history of the South. He knew these people who were marching out there. And it's a little bit of the right force from below hitting, coinciding with an open moral leadership at the top. And the civil rights movement was made by many people. One president signed the law, but he, as he said, we couldn't have done it without you. So that was a real moment. And it's the opposite in the case of Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't do all of this by himself. Had he not had this very powerful extremist right-wing base, he wouldn't have been able to get away with what he did. You know, it's astonishing me, as you said, people didn't know him in 2016 across the country, but still 63 million people voted for him. And I think they largely were voting, many of them were voting against the system, the two-party system that had failed them. But they knew him in the most recent election in 2020, and more, 74 million voted for him. So this time they knew what they were getting. And the insurrection the other day was a climax to try to shut down the counting of the state electoral college votes in the states in order for him to do the opposite of what Lyndon Johnson did, which was deconstruct everything that we've done. And they've succeeded to a large extent. So you must never forget that both for positive and negative purposes, there has to be a constituency. And I've talked to some psychologists who say the first thing to do when you have this kind of situation is to separate the leader from his constituents. And that's why it's important Trump is leaving office, and that's why it's important that he be impeached. And more important is that he be barred from future office, because they will be there waiting for him. They've been nurtured for 250 years, and they're not going to give up so quickly now to try to get back the country that they thought was great, run by white males.
Yeah, I was listening to your interview with Dr. Bandy Lee, since we're here at the Institute and talking about perhaps psychosis, or, I mean, she referred to narcissistic symbiosis, and that Donald Trump was a developmentally wounded leader and met the needs of an arrested development, regressing population. Do you buy into the mentally disturbed, mentally deficient aspect of this, and therefore should have consideration as a mentally ill person as opposed to an evil person?
I am a journalist, not a psychologist. I need psychology more than I probably wish, but Dr. Bandy Lee is a prophet. She predicted in that first book that she edited with some of with Robert J. Lifton and Judith Herman and Tom Singer and James Gilligan, the dangerous case of Donald Trump. They didn't diagnose him. They looked at his behavior and his obvious state of mind and anticipated that this man violence would come from in his wake, and that he was therefore a dangerous man, creating in a dangerous situation. And in this interview I did with her the other day, she's been ostracized by some in the elite establishment of psychologists and psychiatrists. She was ignored by the press after the New York Times wrote an editorial saying that she had no business doing this, trying to assess the mental state of someone she had not interviewed personally, the so-called Goldwater rule. As she went on, she did not run. She went after the hornets, and the hornets came after her. I mean, she stirred the hornet's nest, and they came after her, and the other psychologists. But she is right on in that interview I did with her in the podcast, and she's been all along. I know she was under considerable stress from the opposition, from the right, extremists, death threats and all that. But she stood her ground, and she came out just recently with her own book. These are books I've been reading: Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America So, which I strongly recommend to all of you in this circle here. So I'm not qualified to say anything about his mental health, but a journalist makes our living observing and analyzing the behavior of people we see. And I didn't need a PhD in psychology to recognize in the campaign that from the violence he spewed and from the meanness he revealed, and from the bullying characteristic of his face, and from the inconsistencies, the lies and all this man had a troubled beginning, either stupid or odd parenting. And he was, and of course, I live in New York as you do, and we had these stories about him in the tabloid press, which were revealing of his character. So I agree with Bandy using her language and the language of the 27 others, Gail Shee and others who helped produce that first book, and from reading this past book, that this man is mentally unfit to be president. I wouldn't attach a nomenclature to it. I wouldn't put a tag on it as to what kind. I listened to her and others, and I can see that he's an extreme narcissist, and I can see that all he cares about is himself. That self-obsession is itself a danger. So I don't know how we elected him.
Right. But you mentioned, us as journalists, and the media, and now there's the social media. I would love your take on, did we, the media, fail in some fundamental, consequential way to bring what we all saw was happening to account, and especially the use of the social media of Twitter and Facebook to drum up hostilities in millions and millions of people. You know, what is the consequence, the reconciliation, the recognition of what went wrong with American media in this case?
Well, as Bandy Lee said this week, the social media groups say they're producing news, but they're not producing news. They're producing commentary and opinion, and much of it is malignant. You know, I grew up in the Deep South. The truth was shunned by the newsroom of the South, by the pulpits of the South, by the newspapers of the South, and we got a civil war. I was in the Johnson administration as he escalated the war in Vietnam. We drew the wagons around the White House and refused to listen to the reporting from the ground. Anytime you drive the truth out of your discussion, you're in trouble. Democracies die from too many lies, and the social media is just awash in lies and conspiracy theories. But what particularly happened, Carol, and I hate this term media because you're in the media, I'm in the media, but so is Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson, and I mean, I like to talk about the press and journalists, but the big change came when the fairness doctrine was nullified by Ronald Reagan back in 1980. The fairness doctrine said that if you publish an opinion, you have to publish a contrary opinion so that there's some measure of free debate. And then Edward Murrow did follow the dictates of journalism and try to tell the truth, but there came a time in the 80s when television decided, and television broadcast news decided they were in the business of entertainment, like the big, and they were supposed to give people a good time and show them what's bizarre enough that attracts their attention. And in the lead up to 2016, to the election, they treated Donald Trump as a circus ringmaster, as an attraction in a circus, and they gave him hundreds of hours more than they did Hillary Clinton and others, and they made enormous profits. The president of CBS, Les Moonves, who had to resign in time because of sexual harassment charges, he said, "Let him out, let him out because Donald Trump means ratings for us. Go," he said. They treated the election of the nomination and election of 2016 as a carnival, as a circus, and you had a free ticket if you watched, and their ratings soared, and Donald Trump got away with being nothing but an entertainer for the people who were looking for a commanding figure to articulate their concerns in the halls of power and get rid of those liberals and others. Some organizations since the election, since his inauguration, came to their senses and began to do the thing that they hadn't done for a long time, which was to say what they thought about the behavior they were seeing, and that began to make a difference. But they're outnumbered really by Fox News and the right-wing ecology of information, which is disinformation and misinformation. You can't have a country that is divided by two parallel realities. And the right-wing media and Fox News and all that created a parallel reality. And the people who voted for Trump, millions of them, believe it. They believed it. And therefore, the rest of us who were trying to present an alternative version of it were not believed by them. I can go home to where I grew up now and where I used to be honored as a journalist, and I will have to slip through town because they think I'm a liar and a betrayer of our culture for just simply telling the truth about the man they adore. It's a very religious community, and religion and politics have become a cult in the Republican Party. And I think, I don't know, I think almost everybody, but maybe 10% of my hometown voted for Trump. You know, you asked me about my background. It didn't start with, my interest in this subject didn't start when I worked with Lyndon Johnson closely on the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. 60 some years ago, when I was on my 16th birthday, I went to work for the daily newspaper in my little small town. It was a good place to be a cub reporter because it was small enough to get around, to navigate, but it was large enough to give me a variety of experiences. And then I had a brush of luck that opened my eyes to what was going on. Some of the old hands on the paper were on vacation or they were sick. And so I got at 16, 17, assigned to the team that was working to cover what was called then the Marshall Housewives. The Marshall Housewives were 15 women in my hometown who had joined the national movement not to pay the Social Security withholding tax for their domestic workers, all of whom, of course, were Black. Housewives were white, their housekeepers were Black. 2/3 of all employed Black women in the country then were in domestic service. And because they tended to earn lower wages, accumulate less savings, and be stuck in those jobs all their lives, Social Security was their only insurance against old age poverty. This didn't move their employers. Their housewives argued that Social Security was unconstitutional and that imposing it was like picking up the garbage. That's what they thought of Social Security, required a tax. So they hired a high-powered lawyer. You probably remember him, a notorious former congressman from Texas named Martin Dias, who led the House Un-American Activities Committee. I mean, he was so far right that he needed to be propped up when he got over there. And they lost. And they eventually wound up holding their noses and paying the tax.
What a story.
Well, it took me a while to understand what had happened. This was a deeply segregated antebellum town, the capital of Missouri, in exile after the feds seized the state, temporarily the military capital of the Confederacy after Richmond fell. It was really a conservative Confederate town. 7 generals went from there to the Civil War. And these white women were respectable townfolk. They were good neighbors, regulars at church, some of them in my church. Their children were my friends, their husbands, they were active in community affairs. Their husbands were pillars of the business establishment. And I kept wondering, what was this? And it was years later when I think I figured this spasm of rebellion out. They simply could not see beyond their own prerogatives. They were fiercely loyal to their family, fiercely loyal to their clubs, fiercely loyal to their churches, fiercely loyal to their children. But they narrowly defined membership in society and in democracy as including only their own kindred spirits.
Do you think, Bill, that still explains, as we ask questions about white women in America who consistently seem to vote in large numbers against their own interests? And I want to ask you too about Black women. I love the essay you wrote about Barbara Jordan of some years ago. But there are those who say that the reason that we still have a democracy today is because of Black women who carried the election, who carried Georgia, we now will have in a day or so, a couple of days, a Black woman, Indian American woman, vice president of the United States. We've got that. as an achievement and as a wonderful thing. But the status of Black women in America is still the bottom of the barrel in terms of, we've learned for instance, during the pandemic, that so many of the essential workers making $7 an hour or less in some instances are women of color, are Black women. So here, on the one hand, Black women have consistently been thanked, for saving the democracy, and yet consistently do not benefit from the advantages of this democracy. Your thoughts on that?
It's largely the, until now, untold story of our 250-year history. It was so many Black women kept the family ties to the extent they could. They kept the churches going. They were active in their own segregated communities. And I'm reading several books right over there now about not the famous Black women who deserve their fame, but the unsung heroes among Black women over the many years. And they're really moving stories, but they're not fiction. I mean, they're based in some ugly realities. And yes, if it hadn't been for Stacey Abrams, the Republicans would be controlling the Senate starting next week again, because those two Democrats who won down there would not have won if she had not overcome her anger at losing to a governor of a candidate for governor who had been a beneficiary of voter suppression. And instead of getting mad and writing angry editorials, she went to work and organized that state. Barbara Jordan would be humming the Gospels with her. That was one of the great moments of my life when I gave the eulogy for Barbara after her death. But we have so far to go, and there's so many forces trying to push back. It's going to take all of us. We white males have to march in the second ranks behind the bold young African Americans and people of color and the women who have emerged and the men. I remember, Carol, I was more impressed with the 6 or 7 Black men who came to the White House to argue with Lee. They didn't plead. They argued with the President of the United States that he had to get behind this movement. He was going to anyway. I flew back on Air Force One with him from Dallas after the assassination, watched him in his cabin as he began to write notes to himself about what our agenda would be. That night, 3 or 4 of us stayed at his home with Mrs. Johnson and the Vice President. He talked until 3 o'clock in the morning with this list of what was going to be his agenda after the funeral of President Kennedy. And the first thing on the list, I still have a copy of it, made a copy of it, was move the Civil Rights Bill. Remember, Kennedy had sent up a Civil Rights Bill. He didn't understand the South. Bobby Kennedy didn't understand the South. They didn't really understand Congress. Johnson had spent some decades in there. He said to us, we've got to pass the tax bill first after the funeral. What? There was a tax bill Kennedy had proposed. We said, no, you got to push the Civil Rights Bill. He said, no, and he was the master manipulator of Senate opportunities. He said, if we pull the Civil Rights Bill in for discussion, debate, and filibuster, we'll never get it out, and we'll never get out of the legislation. But go for the tax bill first, bring in the conservatives to vote for it, and then they don't dare stop us when we say, now we've got a Civil Rights Bill, and we're going to stay here till it freezes, until the Washington freezes, until we pass it. And we did pass it. And the Congress passed it, he signed it, as I said before. That is, by the way, consistent with what Heather Cox Richardson has been writing. That is the night he said to me, after he had signed the Civil Rights Bill, as we left to go to Texas for a short break, he said, Bill, I'm paraphrasing now, we just turned the South over to the Republicans for the rest of my life and yours. Wow. And he was right, because the Republicans, the modern conservative Republicans, went south on Richard Nixon's silent majority, which was really a racist platform, and took over what the Democrats had done for 100 years, which is to maintain white male supremacy in the
Right. It all comes back to that, doesn't it, Bill? and I am keeping you way too long for myself. We have some fabulous questions and from our audience that Maria is going to share with us. But thank you, Bill. But I could talk to you all day, all night. You're just wonderful. Maria.
When you get the CRA thing straightened out, that's what we'll do.
Okay, great.
Thank you both so much for this. We have a question about the incoming administration. So to either of you, both of you, how can the Biden-Harris administration address white supremacy and systemic racism in a way that acknowledges the struggles of the white working poor in the US, the diminishing middle class? Do you have some advice for them or perspective?
Well, first of all, they have to hold accountable and responsible the white extremists who were behind the insurrection. They have to show that crime does not pay and that betrayal is punishable. We've had a run of violence lately ever since Trump was elected, and they've got to show this doesn't work. They've got to. Bandy Lee said to me yesterday, the first thing is to separate the poisonous leader from his or her followers, and that's got to happen. And then they have got to try as much as they can to produce legislation that deals with income inequality and housing inequality and others as if it were for anyone suffering from those particular circumstances. There are a lot of poor white working people and a lot of poor whites who don't have affordable housing. So there's still a lot of resentment in the right, in particular among the conservative movement, which picked up the Confederacy program of 100 years ago and put in, the charge was that, no, we can't support the New Deal because it puts money in the hands of these irresponsible Black people. And that's really powerful and real in the mind of white bigots. And so much of what Biden has to do has to include white poor and Black poor. But someone asked me the other day, what do we do about, I interviewed Tanahak Coates for a long time on reparations. And I don't know how reparations would work, but I know the kind of reparations that America needs is to good highways for all, excellent schools for every child, whatever their color or background, good housing, a decent housing, and all that add up to dignity. So the legislation that the Biden administration will have to grope with is legislation particularly aimed at ending discrimination, including systemic racism in our banking laws and our lending laws and our housing codes and our housing zoning codes, but also do programs that show we are all in this together. I don't have specific proposals. It's been a long time since I've been in government, but I know that we have to show we're all in this together. The rich, not the rich, but the poor and the working people.
Right.
Carol, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just add quickly that I think one of the ways of tackling it, a good friend of mine, Jeff Madrick, an economics writer, has a book talking about the poor children of America. We use the word the measurement 1 in 4 children are food insecure, hungry. It's probably 1 in 3. It's probably more than that. And what he advocates and I support is supporting the children, give them an allowance, just as we during the pandemic have given families, money to get by, that we should do the same thing, because I think that's the scandal, the true tragedy of the starving children in the United States of America. And if we can do something to alleviate their hunger by giving an allowance for each child in the family, I think that we might be able to, in a real way, begin to make some progress, white and Black, because the starving children are not only the Black children. There are most of the starving children are not Black. So that would be one way of addressing the Black-white, let's make life better for everyone in the country.
And at the other end of the age spectrum, I think Biden is off to a good start. The Republicans, Mitch McConnell and the others, they were determined to show that a Black man could not govern, that he wasn't competent enough or articulate enough or experienced enough or white enough to be a good president. And they did everything they could to see that he failed. He didn't fail, and he created a new look to government with so many appearances at Black events and so many appointments of Blacks to real jobs. Biden is off to a good start in putting people of color in real jobs in Washington. And I think that's important to show Black men and women that they're more than capable and more capable than the people who've been running the government. And if Biden can lead a true constellation of Americans to show that a multiracial, diverse government can serve a multiracial, diverse nation, it will be a big, real and symbolic message.
As you know, we have attendees from around the world today, and we have a question. People are wondering if you could talk about the American role in shaping global racism.
Well, there have been several good books on that lately about how, in going to the Philippines, we put an autocrat in charge of that country instead of a real small d Democrat, and how in South America and Central America, all of our policies were based on promoting business, and then later keeping the communists out of government. We would support the most atrocious right-wing tyrant in an election, Chile, where we were behind the assassination. I'm sure we encouraged the assassination the United States did of the social democrat who was elected there. All over the world, our policies have been guided by profit more than principle. It's sad, but it's true. And we have a lot of redemption to exercise and achieve in our response to the world these days as poverty rises due to the pandemic everywhere. But our policies have always favored the white colonial governor over a duly elected Black officer in Africa and other places. That's beginning to change a little bit, but the record is unfortunate and a tragic side. America is a place of such splendid ideals and such sordid realities. And that's true in our foreign policy as well.
Right. And I'm going to do a Bill Moyers. I'm going to hold up a book. It's Anne Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, which is a frightening prospect, as we've seen not only here, but across the globe. This blend to wanting an authoritarian leadership and doing away with the democratic way of life, not only here, but elsewhere. So our part in all of that, we apologize for.
But it's a powerful book too. She was one of the first journalists, as you no, Carol, to raise an alarm about these anti-democratic trends in the West and how they're connected to nationalism and autocracy, just as Trump was here. He's at home with the Erdogans, the Putins, the Polish autocrat. He has all the attributes they have, and she's written. I mean, their beliefs and their program are simple, but as she points out, they are inherently appalling as well as appealing. And she describes, what conspiracy theories have done to consolidate their hold on office, just as it's true here. Without the conspiracy theorists, Trump would have been convicted in his first impeachment. I recommend her book highly too.
In relation to electing more competent, supportive presidents for our democracy, what do you think of the idea of instituting qualifications for the presidency other than age and citizenship?
That's a good question.
It is, and how would you measure them? I don't know that the two parties would look at anything but who they think can win. Would you read that again, that question from one of your guests?
Yes. In relation to electing more competent and helpful presidents for our democracy, what do you think of the idea of instituting qualifications for the presidency other than age and citizenship?
That would mean constitutional changes that are probably so difficult to achieve that you'd want to really require or ask or demand politically that the two parties come up with those measures of competence and thoroughly vet the top candidates in the primaries so that we don't have to wait until the very end to discover that we've bought a pig in a poke. But the parties should be more accountable. The candidates should be more experienced and less partisan. And that's going to be a part of the political agenda we have to pursue. Because I repeat this, it's become more and more apparent to me that it starts until we begin governing the way we campaign. We're never going to have faith or trust in government because they can run to the most appealing platforms, and then they go to the White House or the Congress or wherever and do the very opposite. And particularly on this whole issue of money by which the oligarchy is buying the policies they want by their huge donations to the two parties. And I do not exclude the Democrats from that. So we've got to have more vetting of who their contributors are. The Supreme Court has made it possible, of course, for millions of dollars to be sent to candidates in the dark money issue, so that we never know who paid for those ads that elected this member of Congress or that member of Congress. So we've got to deal with that as well. By the way, I want to make it clear that I don't idealize politics and democracy. After all, I worked for Lyndon Johnson, whose favorite story was the card player, the card dealer, who said, "Now play the cards fair, Reuben. I know what I dealt you." I mean, Lyndon Johnson knew how to get his way. When I was working for his television and radio station in Austin, I was given my first introduction to the State House of Representatives, as corrupt a place as you'd ever want to to avoid. I mean, he took me on a tour of the floor, and there were some elderly men flirting with their clerks, and there were a drunk representative over here snoring on his little desk. It was a really opening moment for me, a moment of discovery. And he saw that I was concerned about it. I think I was 19. And he looked at me and he said, "Boy," he said, "if you think these guys are bad," and he waved his hand out across the House chamber, "you should see their constituents." And I've kept that in mind ever since. I have faith in the American people, but I I want to make sure my faith is backed up by facts.
So we have two related questions, and I'll put them together. Having grown up in the racist climate of the Deep South, what helped you to embrace progressive humanistic values? And do you remember the first time you became aware of your white skin privilege?
I was the beneficiary. My father was probably one of the 5 or 6 poorest white men in town. My mother was a housewife, sick a lot, and she lost twins the first time she was pregnant. She had my brother, then she lost another daughter at age 2 or 3. Then I was supposed to be a girl. And she had to work a lot to just help support our family. My father never made more than $100 in his life until the last job he had when he joined the union. So I saw from a distance, we were 10,000 blacks, 10,000 whites in that town, but the twain never really met, except that the black women worked for the white women, as I said. Even my mother, I went with her many times when she took the wash 8 blocks from where we lived to the home of a black woman who would do that wash for 25 cents. And so I saw it from that distance, but it didn't strike me as a young kid why we were doing that, why we didn't do our own wash. It proved, I did a documentary about my hometown called Marshall, Texas, and I concluded that it was possible to grow up well-loved, well-taught, and well-schooled, which I was on each count, and still be unaware of the lived experience of people just 8 blocks from you. And that's when I began to think, when I went off to Europe for a scholarship, and I kept reading these papers about Americans, white Americans responding so negatively and powerfully to the Civil Rights Act, Civil Rights protest of the 60s. And I wrote a column for my hometown paper and said this, and that they were undermining the image of America in the world as democracy. And the people who gave me the scholarship were so upset they almost withdrew it when it ran in the paper because they couldn't take that kind of judgment. And their reaction began to make me wonder. But I never dwelled on this, you know. I never dwelled on it. And then I helped organize the Peace Corps and traveled abroad, particularly to Africa, many times. And it just began to hit me, the reality of the other. The other was always around, but not vetted or acknowledged. And I could see from Africa in the 1960, 61, and 62, as they were coming to liberation, Ghana, Nigeria, Guinea, places like Ethiopia, I see places like that where blacks were beginning to exercise power once the colonials had left. And I began to think about it. I had no come to Jesus moment. I grew up in a segregated church, went to segregated schools, worked on a segregated newspaper, and never grappled with my privilege, because I was picked up by this group and that group and moved along. My school teachers gave me favors and privileges, and it just came out. It was part of the natural world. That's the way the world was, is the insight stored in the back of my head. That's the way the world was. I do not remember ever deliberately or willingly acting like a racist. I was a systemic racist, I guess, because I didn't know, I didn't pay attention. And it was only when I moved out in the world, if I were to do a memoir, it'd be called The Education of a Journalist, because I got my education from being out in the world and covering stories. When I published Newsday out in New York, we put together the first large program of Black interns. I don't know why we did that, except it came natural at that time, after I'd been in Washington. But I think the moment was the civil rights movement and the experiences of the Black youngsters young men and women down there, who were so courageous, who were so brave. You couldn't avoid admiring them. You couldn't avoid seeing what they were up against. And then, of course, Selma, I knew John Lewis very well, later did a documentary about him. And I began to see this as reported. Then I'll tell you a turning point, and I'll be quiet. I went in 1973 to talk to Gunnar Myrdal in Sweden. Some of you remember that Gunnar Myrdal did that incredible study of the American dilemma. That was the title of his book about the racial issue in this country. And it was extremely powerful and extremely controversial. And I wanted to talk to him in person. So I went over there. And he explained more brilliantly to me the sociological, psychological, and political context of the American dilemma, which he saw that we are proclaiming liberty, all men are created equal, but we're enslaving millions of Blacks. How do you deal with the morality of an issue like that? And that conversation began a long journey on my part to understand that question. How is it that we had such splendid ideals and such sordid realities? And an essay by Ralph Ellison and the work of several other Black writers at that. I went down to North Carolina and interviewed John Hope Franklin about this. And we had long talks, and the kind of light came in, and I began to see it, not just in this of Marshall, Texas, but the whole sweep of American history, which is a constant struggle to release Black people from their ostracism by diminishing the power of white males. And it was slow. It was a learning process.
Bill, I do want to tell you that I'm coming to you, zooming to you now from Ralph Ellison's apartment building in New York City on Riverside Drive, where he wrote The Invisible Man, and where right outside is this wonderful Invisible Man statue done by Elizabeth Catlett, one of the, the foremost Black women sculptors. So, I just wanted you to know that, and that I love.
If you get a chance, read his review of Gunnar Myrdal's
I will.
Dilemma.
I have it. I will. I'm going to go back to it. But I love your statement, the reality of the other, which I think is, really gets to the core of it, of being able to live 8 blocks from a totally different world, as we're talking about parallel universes today. And I think and I think it's true, too, when you say that's the way the world was, because I think I told you the story of I was in high school and attending a private school in New York City when my high school history teacher, in the middle of the class, and in front of all of my, fellow and sister students, said to me, "Carol," because I was the only Black child in that class, I'm so sorry. I apologize to you because this is not your history. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I was like, so that was my reality, because nothing we were studying in the history books mentioned, there was like maybe 2 lines about slavery, but, that was it. Otherwise we're completely invisible. And that too, that was the way the world was. So.
Carol, this is hard to believe, but I went from the 1st grade to the 12th grade in the schools of this town where I grew up. I had the most wonderful teachers. Miss Simpson, my 1st grade teacher, lived down the 3 doors from us in the east side of town. Selma Brutsey could teach the British poets with a precision of a drone, coming at your mind and saying you must pay attention. And Inez Hughes wouldn't let us read poetry because she didn't think we were young enough to know it. So she'd hold the book out, like I see her standing for 50 minutes in an English class reading poetry. Great teachers,
Right.
but racist.
Right.
They were they were racist, and I grew up knowing nothing of slavery and Jim Crow, and what it meant to be on the other side from us. Our white identity was considered in Marshall, Texas, a basic American value. And since identity is our anchor in life, when are you freed from it? Because your identity doesn't change. It's never if you carry it into a world that fits you, which is what the world of white supremacy was. It was a world that fit someone who had been informed by the culture and neighbors and others who believed, who taught us that, and pastors who taught us that the universe designed the world we live in, the universe being God, and that we didn't dare defy God or the universe by trying to say this wasn't the natural order of things. Once you reach that moment, that anchor is around your ankle drops away and you begin to see the other. One of the great lines that really I shivered at when I heard it the first time I saw Death of a Salesman, when Arthur Miller's script said, attention, his wife said, attention must be paid. I have never forgotten that as a moment applying not just to her poor struggling husband, but to all of us. We have to pay attention to each other in a way that removes the thingness about us and makes us realize the kinship that we share. The world is seriously deficient in empathy. What is empathy? I think Shakespeare got close to it when he said to Gloucester on the heath, how do you see the world? And Gloucester, who was blind, said, I see it feelingly. I see it feelingly. We need empathy in the world today. And my answer to most of the questions are being asked about what to do, find ways to bring empathy out of the youngest child, where it starts. I urge you to read another book that I read several years ago by Barry, the psychiatrist, the child psychiatrist, Barry, and a colleague of mine, a former producer who's now a writer, worked with him, Maya Solovitz, wrote a book called Born to Love. And it's about the importance of helping children develop their ability to perceive the other as if they were brother or sister or kindred spirits, because they are.
So powerful.
Is what we need.
Yeah, so powerful, Bill. Powerful.
Maybe you've anticipated this question in your last response. We have, many educators in our group today, and they're wondering to what extent can the U.S. education be engaged to foster human awareness and confronting incidents of people conquering and subduing other humans. Is this our story to be revealed? And I think, I also read today in the Wall Street Journal editorial about the 1776 Commission and their efforts to bring history to schools with a different slant.
Right, and the furor over, Bill, I'm sure you're going to talk about the 1619 project, so that's, yeah.
Right, 1619 project is one place to begin, because it starts, the so-called explorers who came here before we were a nation, they were really slavers. They were really looking for economic profit from slaves. And we haven't discussed that, and I guess there's not time to discuss it today, is how economics is tied to slavery. And, there was I think it was Alexander, one of the Confederate leaders said, oh no, the Donald Trump wanted to put on the Fed recently. He wanted to make a commissioner of a fellow named Moore, who actually said that capitalism is more important than democracy, when the best of our founders, the wisest of our founders, believed that money, capitalism, should be braked, B-R-A-K-E-D, by democracy. That is, that democracy was meant to diminish the excesses of people who would use their money to increase their privilege and their power. But my answer to that, the context of that question is start with kindergarten. I will never forget sitting in endless meetings to discuss Head Start when it was part of our campaign against poverty. We had every expert we could get on childhood education to come in. And the message was always the same, expressed differently. Start with the child, start with the child. We started, I think, with Head Start in kindergarten, but it's preschool really when you have to start. We need a radically new investment in education that does begin with children, Black, white, of color, of the projects and the suburbs. We need to start developing their ability to pay attention and their ability to feel, to feel what they believe. You know, children are very susceptible. They really are. And we should take advantage of that to make sure that every child's susceptibility
Right.
is informed, nurtured, and warmed by the realization that companionship, comradeship, cooperation, collaboration, trust, all of that make the better life. And that's going to, I'm not an educator. A lot of you out there are. There's your assignment. The White Institute challenges you.
Right. And I just want to say thank you to the teachers who have been so pressed to keep up with the events of homeschooling and everything that we've been through. I have 3 grandchildren. One of my, the 7-year-old granddaughter, 2nd grade. My daughter shared the homework with her, and it was that the teachers were taking the children through the difference between a protest and a riot. And that was the homework that a 7-year-old had to, well, needed to go through to understand what was happening in the world. So my credit, you know, to all of you teachers out there, because it was a masterful explanation of the difference that most adults still don't understand, but that these 2nd graders got schooling on. So your assignments these days are so astronomically different from what anything that anybody ever expected. So thank you for the work you're doing with our children.
I second that. And I would say to everyone, our democracy came very close, what we call democracy. And we're a long way from that perfect union. Right. We're a long way from equality. But keep in mind that America is so broken. Our political system is so inept and inadequate that only some very radical reforms will work. And I'm not, you know, I'll be accused of being a socialist. No, I'm not. I believe this has to come from the private, the teachers and the educators and all of us. But we have got to not just repeat the mistakes we made at modest reforms back in the Obama administration and elsewhere. We have got to really think deep about how we restructure American institutions so that the goal is not to advance the interest of anyone except those who deserve it, and that is everyone. And that's got radical.
And I think we're getting comments that both of you are educators. So we thank you for that. And also, we've had many requests for the authors and the books that you've recommended. So if you will send a list to me, we will make sure that everyone who's registered for this event could get that reading list.
Well, you also can blame one of my neighbors and good friends and one of your trustees who lives just a few for this for inflicting me on you this morning. I'll give him that list and he can get it to you.
We're grateful to David
Let me
Solomon
say one thing.
I,
bringing you to us.
Let me say
Yeah.
one thing, that journalists are licensed to explain things we don't understand. And that's what journalism has been for me, a long course in adult education, so that I finally came to see that we journalists are just beachcombers on the shores of other people's experience. And that's what I spent my life doing, combing the beaches of knowledge and of people who have experienced or learned how the world works and what makes it wag. And that's what a journalist does. And I've been very privileged to have 50 years at it, 7 more years in government in a very difficult time. And I appreciate your letting me share some of my experiences with you.
And I recommend BillMoyers.com, where he's doing magnificent podcasts and has all of his essays, all of his books. It's an extraordinary, and even a timeline, from the 16-year-old cub reporter straight through to 2021. Bill, it's quite an accomplishment. My
Thank you.
thrill to be in a conversation with you.
Thank you. Journalism is as cooperative and competitive, is as much a cooperation as a football team or a basketball team or an ERI drive. And you mentioned, I thought you were going to say when you said timeline, we've had 3 incredible timelines that have become deep resources for journalists and educators, done by an acclaimed Chicago lawyer named Stephen Harper, who started first doing a timeline of the Trump-Russia connection. And then he did a timeline of the impeachment.
Right.
And then he did a timeline of the pandemic. And now he's doing a timeline again of impeachment. So he and his daughter started this timeline, and I grabbed it up because it's brilliant. It's education, it's observation, it's factually driven. It's a great place to go when you don't want to pick up a newspaper.
Tell Judith we want her on the front lines for the ERA. We need her back. So
she was 30 years. She ran our production company, and
I know.
She retired first because she's a great executive and very creative. She was executive producer so much that we did. But she retired at 80, and I retired at 81 and came back at 82. This is my 6th retirement.
I have a few of those, and yeah, too.
The difference between you and me, Carol, is that you're not as old as I am, and so the side effects of a long life have not begun to catch up with you yet.
I don't know. I'm right behind you there. I rejoice every time you come out of retirement. It means we can count on more great journalism.
I want to thank you both today for your very warm, empathic, and heartfelt and inspiring conversation. I can't think of a better way for us to begin our studies. And you've given us a lot to think about. And I thank you in advance for the book list. I also want to thank our audience for being here, for joining us today. And if everything goes well with the technology, Bill has graciously offered to post today's webinar on his blog and on Democracy Now! We also hope to have it on the Institute's website.
Marie, may I say one more thing?
Yes, absolutely.
Here was an eye-opening moment for me that I want you to put in the context of what I've told you. 1960, the election, John Kennedy is running for president, Lyndon Johnson is running for vice president. I'm Lyndon Johnson's body man. And we're entering Nashville to go visit the governor and have a rally downtown. And we go through streets that are full of protesters, white protesters, most of them women, white women with ugly fire in their eyes, mean posters about Johnson selling out the South by running with the Catholic Kennedy. And it was just an ugly scene. And he started reminiscing and he said, "See those signs?" I said, "Yes, of course I see them. They're all around the car." And he said, "Bill, if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice. you're picking his pocket.
Mm.
That's the story of race, slavery, and democracy, and capitalism.
Wow.
Oh,
Wow. What a way to end. That's incredible.
exactly. Well, we hope that you'll come back on February 6th for our next meeting. Our guests will be Dr. Ganandri Yakim and Dr. Lara Sheehy. The focus of our study on February 6th will be Palestine as we start to continue our journey around the globe. And we hope to see all of you again as we continue our studies of racism, discrimination, and othering. And in the meantime, I hope everyone stays safe and well, wear a mask, take care of yourself, and we hope to see you again.
Thanks so much, Maria. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bill.
Carol.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you,
Thank
Carol.
you.
Love you.